The Australian Institute of Sport was set up in 1981 primarily to address the lack of Olympic medals that Australia was in a drought of, but it has since evolved and now is seen as a leader within the national sports system, leading in both expertise and development of sporting prowess throughout the nation. We have an expert panel here to speak to you today. We've got Ross Smith, who is from the Australian Institute of Sport. He's the lead of strength and conditioning here at the centre. He has spent 14 years at the Australian Institute of Sport, and he's spent 20 years in elite sport itself. On the left of the screen is Major Simon Bowen. He's a physiotherapist by trade. He's currently the officer in command of the Human Performance Centre up in North Queensland, and is currently implementing trials and programs the regular army on how human performance initiatives will perform in North Queensland. We've also got Sergeants Chris Wilkinson and Tim Boland. They're PTIs at RMCD. Obviously, they have responsibility for training and the future leaders of the Australian Army. And they have a varied background supporting units, both up in 3 Brigade up in Townsville and also in Randwick in Sydney. Okay, with no further ado, I'm going to hand across to Ross and the team. They'll start off with the discussion, and then we'll move to your questions. Sergeant Wilkinson, over to you.
Biddy, thanks, sir. So, Ross, guys, thanks for giving up your time today. Just want to open up with strength conditioning, which is the method of where we physically and physiologically prepare athletes for elite performance utilising exercise prescription. We've got 3 primary topics that we want to try and cover. The first one being, what does the AIS high performance space look like? How do the AIS strength conditioning coaches track athlete load, and also how they manage injured athletes? And if we have the time to get to it, is how they structure individual and team training. So Ross, the first question I've got for you is, what is your vision of high performance in the AIS?
For me, the AIS is about developing athletes through their career. So starting from junior levels, so we've got athletes here as young as 15, 16-year-old, right through to winning gold medals. So I'm very much part of a team approach. So across our network of S&C, medical, physio, psychology, biomechanics, nutrition, physiology, all these areas come together to develop the physical characteristics, in my case, physical characteristics of athletes to excel in their sport. And very much working with the sport, working with the team, the coaches and the athletes to get that outcome.
Yeah. So you're talking about your allied health sort of support now, all those assistant personnel you guys have. How do you guys work together to achieve the best outcome for the athlete?
End of the day, we start probably with the end thought process. So what's our key goal? What's our outcome? We really understand what that is. What's the requirements of the sport? Because of the nature, we have 34 different sports that we work with at the AIS. They're very different in their outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So once we have a clear understanding of what the outcome is, then we work with our team to develop a plan around how we're going to achieve that outcome, looking at where the athlete is and how we progress to. So very much a team approach. So for that to be successful, you need the coach and the athlete buy-in, but also you need the allied health, the doctor, the physio, and identifying the needs and requirements, and how, as an S&C coach, we can have real effect. End of the day, I work with road cycling. So working with road cycling, I'm not going to do much physical aerobic conditioning with them. They'll ride bikes and they'll be on a 6-hour ride. So when they come in and see me, it's very targeted towards their pneumatic control, building strength, building good body position and body awareness so they can be effective on the bike. I'm not going to make them go for a run. They're already doing hours and hours of aerobic conditioning. But if you look at, say, I also work with in athletics and some of my sprint guys, I am doing some conditioning work in the gym and in other areas because their sport specific is very much around explosive power. So I'm still developing that in the gym, but I'm also working on other areas of general conditioning of the body to allow them to perform that environment. So a real good understanding of what the requirements is, but also where that physical conditioning is going to occur in their training environment, whether it occurs specifically in the sport or whether I can have a high effect in my environment. So, this it sounds strange, but say working with road cyclists, I don't do any sort of endurance-based training in the gym with road cyclists. It's all about strength and good body control and good body awareness, because I'm not going to have an impact in that space. So it's really understanding what it is you're trying to achieve, how it links with the overall training environment, and who's responsible for each area.
You mentioned there the relationship that you have with the specific coaches. What are some shortfalls that you come across, or challenges that you come across in order to maintain that relationship?
The big thing in that space is building a relationship, and then sometimes it's lack of trust. They don't know you. History is a massive issue. Culture is a massive issue. As I've worked with a lot of endurance athletes, they are adverse to going to the gym because that's not their culture. We don't go to the gym, we can't put on a gram of weight because that's bad. But you can put on a gram of weight if the performance outcome is greater than the detrimental of that increased weight load. So changing that culture and building that relationship and building the trust is really important to build that ability to work in that space and really understand whose role and whose responsibility it is to get that outcome, and how you work effectively as a team. It can't be the worst case scenario for me is the coach sits out there and the coach just goes, you go do stuff in the gym over there. That's the worst case scenario for me. It builds, doesn't allow me to get good outcomes. So I actually spend a fair bit of time out of the gym in the sporting environment, just really work with the coach and the athlete to understand theirs, so I can be really effective in my area.
Yeah, I was pretty much going to ask similar questions what Tim's done now. I assume you just mentioned before your endurance cycling. I guess we have a bit of an issue, we'll say, in defence where the scientific process behind strength and conditioning delivery isn't always well recognised by people who may get information from elsewhere. So you said then it's just about building a relationship between. So in our context, that relationship, I guess, will be between the individual and the physical trainers or the CFLs that are around them. How, when you don't get that relationship building, when they can't really see you, how do you manage, so say, a satellite view of coaching? So how do you assist them to meet their performance goals that you're trying to achieve without actually having direct oversight?
That becomes quite difficult in that space to understand and work with the coach. But again, it's about monitoring, talking to the athlete, talking to the coach about, even though you might see them that much, how their training program and protocols adapt, and you have to adapt and change yours to suit that environment. So it could be a case of question later on about monitoring and how you monitor the loading, how you, when the athlete comes in, how you understand what they've already done in the day. So if they've done a hard aerobic session, there's no point in me bashing them again. And the coach could have changed and varied the session, which you often have, that the coach get angry and suddenly the session goes from 30 minutes to 2 hours, and they come into my environment, and you have to be very much adaptive to get the outcomes you want to achieve, not just repeat bash them again. So how you manage that relationship becomes really important in that space.
So you had some recent experience with being able to, or being put in a position where you're able to observe some Army soldiers in training. We're talking about physical qualities. From what you were exposed to, what sort of physical qualities did you identify that soldiers generally should be working to achieve? Sort of from my, sort of things such as cardiovascular endurance, muscular endurance, muscular strength, as examples.
I think looking across that, there's a certain physical qualities of any sort of environment that you work in. And I was very fortunate, I got to see some of the stuff of the Special Forces, and I got to see your environment. There's going to be differences in the key outcomes you're trying to achieve, and they should be recognised and developed in that space. So, but there's any sort of elite athlete, regardless of the sport they do, have to have a general baseline conditioning around them. So that's a baseline strength, aerobic conditioning, anaerobic conditioning, all these body control, movement patterns, all these sort of things become really important. It's something that is often mistaken, that endurance athletes don't need strength, or sprint athletes don't need basic aerobic conditioning. These things are very important. It's just to what degree do you need to be effective in your environment?
Also the right time as well, I suppose, yeah.
And the right time, the right area. So 100-metre sprinter needs aerobic conditioning to recover from all the training they do. So we do aerobic conditioning, but also need explosivity, strength and power. Endurance road cyclist needs to put on a sprint to stay on the back of the bunch or to win a race. So they need explosive power and strength, not just aerobic qualities. So understanding that all athletes need all qualities, it's just to what degree and what degrees of those qualities are needed to excel in your sport, in my area, in your sport, in your area, in your occupation.
And this probably brings us to, I guess the military historically has pursued the endurance route. I would suspect the three components, say your endurance, strength and mobility.
Yep.
Historically, endurance seems to be front and foremost. However, as you say, it depends on the trade. Infantry, engineers, trucks, they all do a different role effectively, and so they need different elements of whether it's endurance, strength, and mobility at the time. And how do you train? I mean, let's think about training for a little bit. If we're trying to deliver the three components, physical training instructors will need to be the ones and the experts at the coalface effectively for us. How do you manage those three components across a career of an athlete? Is there times when you might focus on one over the other, or is it when does it become more important in different areas? And I'm more curious as to how the physical training instructors would actually get that education.
Interesting question in that space. End of the day, we need to build an athlete over time and build an athlete over a career. But as I was talking to you guys yesterday, there's no athlete is phenomenally excel in all areas. No athlete is perfect in all areas or exceptional areas. All athletes have strengths and weaknesses. And that allows them, say in a team environment, like a team sport environment, to excel and be part of the team. But across the team, you have differing athletes who excel in different areas. So that creates a greater team if they all excel. So where do you identify your strengths? Where do you identify your weaknesses? End of the day, we look at those and go, all athletes to perform at the highest level and win Olympic gold medals, they need to be exceptional in some area to excel, to exceed. But also they need to minimise their weaknesses so their competition can't use their weakness against them. So looking at that, as me as an S&C coach, I need to try and minimise their weaknesses, and then you have to develop a plan around that. So it might be a case of, at this stage of their career, they're a junior athlete, they're going to be very different in their strengths and weaknesses to what you need as an elite senior athlete. So looking at that space, how do you develop an athlete over a career? So early in their career, it might be their body control is their limiting factor. So I work a lot around that what's limiting them going forward and excelling and being part of that progression in their career. So early stage, very different limiting factors to their end of their career. So working on those, trying to remove the limiting factors so they can perform at the level they need to perform at. But a lot of that is about experience, knowing the basics, knowing there's an education around that space is developed through university education, ACA education course, all those sort of things. We develop those skill sets, mentoring of people across sports. One of the greatest things I've had is I've worked with probably about 15, 20 sports in my career, and learning and understanding the sport and how that applies to different sports is a massive component to me in developing my career.
So this probably goes into a point that we were speaking about yesterday about engaging, so talking about the chain of command at all levels, engaging with the PDIs as the dependencies. So how can we improve that sort of cross communication for PDIs to assist commanders?
Yeah. So I guess the simple answer to that is trust that a scientific evidence-based program that is based on periodized strength and conditioning that fits within the training schedule, and then the unit commanders actually allow you the opportunity to lay this out on the ground for over 12 months, or if we talk about the fourth generation cycle, over 3 years, depending on what you're doing within that time frame, and actually have faith that the program itself will get you what you need out of it. And so that's probably where the key part is, that relationship between the groups. So the physical training instructor has a role to play, as do the CFLs within the unit, as does the chain of command. And not only that, but the individual soldier as well. Whoever's conducting the training also has a role to play in adhering to the program. So yes, the relationship is actually probably one of the most important parts of actually delivering a scientific-based program that captures all 3 components and doesn't just focus on one specific component at any one time.
But again, that stems back to the culture that we've spoken about and that Ross has alluded to, and that the culture is one built on foundation and gradually progressing, not a culture that's built on bashing people and moving people into the ground, but more building from the fundamentals and gradually progressing into a more human performance realm.
Yeah, so there's a lot of energy has been invested in this space lately into improving the delivery of exercise and physical training within the trained force. I guess for a while we've been able to control the delivery more through like Kapuka and initial training for officers as well as ORs. And then it gets to a point in Land Army, all of a sudden that training continuum gets shut down and it just goes to ad hoc PT, which is not the best approach. But there's a lot of effort and energy has been expended lately in trying to correct that. Sorry, Chris.
So no, that's all right. So with regards to the fourth generation cycle and trainees coming from IT schools, and we're talking about long-term development of soldiers here now, is how do we test and adjust physical training when we have soldiers going from ITs to the ready phase in the fourth gen cycle as opposed to the reset phase? We're asking these trainees to perform almost immediately here. We're not giving them the opportunity to develop their conditioning, strength, endurance, and so forth over time.
Yeah. Well, I guess we need to understand the baseline of where people are at when they actually walk into the training force, and that's without going into too much depth in policy. Certainly, there's an understanding that people sort of get up to their units with minimal injury at the time. I mean, granted, that does happen. A good level of strength and conditioning that's already there, which enables you to fit them in. So some of the, I guess, the trials we're looking at implementing up in 3 Brigade is to test people on entry to the brigade. So they'll come into the brigade, they'll conduct a specific series of tests, which actually give us a baseline level of performance. From that, then we can progress them depending on what part of the fourth generation cycle we are within. So this probably is a good opportunity, I suppose, to mention a proposed trial which is being raised in Townsville, which is with it's just building on some good relationships we already have with North Queensland Cowboys up there, the football team, and Sparta Science in the US, and that's where it specifically comes down to a series of tests which we can conduct, which is basically force plate testing, which comes up with a risk of injury out of that. And if the risk is low, then the person's allowed to then carry on into the trained force. They learn their conditioning protocols and then how to fit in with the unit training schedule. The physical training instructor, of course, should already know that they've just come in off that package and where they start. So we expect from this we should reduce our risk of injury significantly, because it's basically preemptive work. So we should be able to reduce our risk of injury, and because people will get exercises out of this particular test, which would then strengthen certain deficits which they might have picked up through ITs or had prior to enlistment. Ross, in your case, when people come into the AIS, I assume you would have something similar where you conduct baseline testing and try to find out what their deficits might be from the outset.
Yeah, very much the case. So we look at, so I'll probably take the example of our basketball program, which is our junior men's and women's national team program. So they come in at 16 years old. When they arrive, they have a medical screening, physio screening, S&C screening. We then work very closely with the coach to understand their current physical capabilities. These athletes coming in, they're basketball athletes already in national team or junior national team or in that pathway. So they're very highly skilled basketball players. but a lot of the athletes are very lowly skilled physical specimens. So very tall, so currently got a 16-year-old kid who's 7 foot tall. So their ability to move, there's no strength training background or history in a lot of these athletes. So understanding that basic starting point is really important for us. So then how you do work with the coach to develop their on-skill court training, their gym training to develop their physical capabilities and capacities, and develop that over a period of time to minimise their injury risk, minimise their chance of injury. It's elite sport, athletes get injured, but you need to try and minimise that, control that, and look at the variables that can create those injury spaces. So we look at a lot of basic load monitoring, things that we don't have massive jumps in load or massive changes in load, how we slowly develop this athlete knowing the outcome we want to achieve. So these athletes will be in our program for up to 2 years or a bit over 2 years. So we know the product we want to send out. So we're very much building the athlete up as quickly as we possibly can within our parameters to get them up to that training load that we want. And then by the end of the time here, have the quality of training in that space at a high enough training load. So when they go into the college system in the US, which a lot of the basketballers do here, or into the NBA program in Australia or WNBA program in Australia, they're ready to play at that level. They're ready to go. So we're very much on that pathway. But all athletes, again, identify where they're at, identify where they need to go, build them up as quickly as possible within our parameters of control their loading.
So what systems do you guys have in place in order to track an individual's load?
So currently in those programs we have, we call our athlete monitoring system, AMS. So that tracks their general health and wellbeing, and also it tracks their training sessional load. So how many minutes they train for, the intensity of that training load, and we then review that.
But not just in the gym, but on the court as well.
All training loads. So anywhere where they do any sort of physical conditioning or physical load, we'll track that loading. And it's really important to get that overall training load and understanding of the overall training load. And we can then manipulate how we input and change that information and change the training loads to develop these athletes and progress them through.
And so with that is a discussion we've had in the past of even if they have experienced a high level of load, it's not getting to you and you saying, no, you won't do anything today. They're still always coming in, always completing something.
Yep. Yeah, so at the end of the day, off our training load data, the last resort, and always the very last resort, is to not train. We vary the way we train or the type of training load that we do. So example, they could be done a very high intensity session on the court, then they come into a gym setting, we're supposed to do another high intensity session. We might go, let's vary that session to a slightly lower intensity session over a slightly longer period of time. So the actual neurological input on the athlete is lower, but we're still getting a good training load and maintain training load. But also we can then target some other weaknesses. We might go, okay, they're not quite aerobically physically fit enough. We can increase that aerobic fitness in that space, knowing that we can't continue to increase the neurological training load in that space. So at the end of the day for us, absolute last resort is to stop training. That's never our result. We want to actually, end of the day, always slowly increase training loads. Some of our athletes train 3 times a day, 6 days a week. So that's the training loads we want to get some of our athletes to. That's, again, a progressive build-up, but a well-planned system and a very smart system in how we do that. And identifying the types of physiological load. We can't just do the same stuff all the time. We need to vary it up and change it and be very adaptive in that space.
So I think maybe one of these ones that, for example, our listeners can take away when it comes to tracking load is we don't always have the technology and the resources to track utilising things like GPS, your apps, Smartbase and so forth But a way that you can actually track athlete load is by utilising the rate of perceived exertion table times intensity, which gives you your intensity. When you times that by time, it will give you an overall load rating. So the RPE scale is effectively a scale from 0 to 10, 0 effectively sitting down doing nothing, 10 working maximally. And the individual will basically give a RPE rating based on their individual feeling or perception of that session, and you times that by the time of the session it takes, and that'll give you an overall load rating. So effectively, you know, a commander or a PDI can track this load throughout the week, and in particular, applying the principle of recovery when we're seeing an athlete or a soldier starting to hit that threshold of load, maybe apply a bit of recovery just to modify their training session, because if you start training beyond where they've reached threshold, effectively you're going to be putting the soldier in a poor position where they may sustain an injury or hit some sort of fatigue, whether it be mental or physical.
Yeah, so, and on that basis, yeah, we need to be able to track that, really. So smart science and application of science, we need to be able to get the data and the raw data to do it. So one of the components of the trials we're conducting in North Queensland at the moment, I know SASR are also using a similar tool. I believe Tucumano down in Sydney has something different. One of the athlete monitoring systems that's currently in play is an application called SmarterBase, basically by an Australian company called Fusion Sport. So it's not necessarily the one that will be used in the military in the future. It's just one that we're currently using, and we're seeing what we can achieve out of it. But part of that process is the monitoring and what the load ratio, so the acute on chronic, so how much we're carrying for how long over what period of time. And this is very important when it comes to returning from periods of reduced tempo or periods of activity in the field. So how do you quantify how challenging a 4-week period is in the field if you're physically working at 60% most of the time for 8 to 9 hours a day, or are you sitting next to an airfield doing nothing for 3 weeks, which does happen on exercise, let's face it. So we need to know these sorts of figures before we can then come back and input that sort of information into our athlete management system, which we're just kicking off to use in Townsville at the moment, because then that can inform the next series of exercise that somebody undertakes. At what level of strength are they working? And when they went to the field, they were working at 80% plus. Now we might need to back them off to the 50 to 60% and then build them back up again. But it's very difficult to do that if we don't have accurate information. It relies very heavily at this point in time on the soldier or the individual putting that information in there, and that's something we've got. So my question back to you, Ross, is how do you encourage that accuracy of information to go in there when you don't have direct oversight of all the activities? Because this is a problem that we're going to be dealing with. I mean, the PDI is not necessarily going to be in the field with them, so it's going to rely on this information uploaded to be able to make decisions on the collective.
In our environment, it's up to the athlete as well. So the athlete is responsible for inputting their data. And the biggest thing I push in my environment is education. Because if an athlete understands why they're doing it, the athlete understands the benefits to them, and they can read their own data and see the benefits, they're far more likely to input that data themselves. I don't have time to input the data to all the athletes that I work with. So it's very much up to the athlete. But that education piece around for the athlete and to the coach of the usefulness and the outcomes you're trying to achieve is probably the starting point of any sort of athlete monitoring system, one. And two is the actual back-end monitoring. If we're not looking at it and not monitoring it effectively, we're not reacting to it, then the athlete becomes very quickly aware that they can put stuff in and there's no reaction to it. So without that, us reacting to it and actually doing something about it, the athlete then loses buy-in and loses control of it. And that's very much in the case of, and even all the athlete monitoring system we look at doesn't mean our athletes don't get sore and tired and they struggle. Our periodic cycle is that. And I very much tell athletes at the end of this 3-week block, you're going to be sore, you're going to be tired, you're going to start to struggle. That's acceptable. And when they feed in their data, I can then go back to them and go, yep, you're on this level, and I'm happy with that amount of soreness and tiredness. That's okay, because we're a recovery week next week. Or no, we've gone over the edge, we're going to pull you back a little bit. So that's how we don't use this as a black and white measure to go, you've reached this level, you're no longer training for the rest of the month, well, the rest of the week. No, that's not occurring. You're still training, we just might modify how we train. It's never a pull out again. It goes back to that thing. At all times, we want to minimise the sessions lost. We need to optimise the training to achieve that.
So we're sort of just tapped into structuring
that links us
training.
nicely to some of our questions, which I think we'll move on to now. For the outstations, please keep the questions coming through. They are flooding in. This has sparked great debate across the nation, rather like question time in Parliament. Send them through to me on 0447 144 706, and I'll put them to the panel. We're probably not going to get through all the questions today, but what we will do is when we upload the recording of this onto the website, those questions we can't ask today will be given to the panel, and we'll put those answers up in written form. So, Ross, you were just talking, and this question is from Lieutenant Patterson from the Education Wing in North Queensland, and it links to what you were just talking about. He says that it was mentioned that physiological loads need to be varied as much as possible. Using these physiological loads to set performance goals, is there a point where an individual or an athlete can have too many performance goals at one given time? Is there an optimum amount of performance goals for a set given period?
I'd say very much yes, because in a training, loading and adaptation, some things work against each other. So if you do a really high aerobic conditioning load, you're not going to be able to develop pure maximal strength load at the same time. Both will progress, but both will be limited by that training load. So if the goal outcome of our training is to specifically develop a certain quality, because we identify that as a limitation, we need then to identify what else is going to have an effect on this. So if I'm developing maximal rate of strength development in the gym, I need to be mindful of the aerobic load that's going on at the same time. Both can occur at the same time, but you can't load both to a high level at the same time. So the answer to the question, do we have specific goals at certain times? Absolutely. Do we limit them? Absolutely. We need to control that environment so we can get the outcomes we want to achieve in that space. But that comes back to really good planning for our environment to go. Say I've got an athlete, in the off season we develop certain qualities, which is going to be different to the skills and the qualities we develop in season, because we know we can't do both at the same time. So we plan that we've got to a certain level in off season this year, knowing that next year we need to get back into that space in the off season, but we can't do it in season. So we very much target approaches around that.
And just to confirm what you're saying that just because someone's just trying to build an aerobic base, you're not totally excluding strength.
Yeah, absolutely. We're targeting for all athletes, all our complete spectrum of training load at all times. It's just the quantity that we do in each space is our variable and how we manipulate this space. Because basically, at the end of the day, if you take an area out, you say, okay, we're doing pure aerobic loading, we're going to take out all strength. That strength quality drops very quickly. And then when you step back into it, you're starting from a very low level. So you need to tap away a little bit at it to maintain in that time period. So I'm building aerobic, I want to maintain my strength levels. So when I come back into that space again, when I want to build strength again, I'm not going from a very low level of maintaining what I've got. The worst thing you can do in a training environment for us is to train someone for 6 months and then lose that in the next 6 months, then we start again.
And that's probably very similar to us, that, as I was saying before, an activity which is coming up could be completely different to the next one.
Yep.
So physical training instructor in consultation and conjunction with the unit chain of command needs to understand the training schedule, so then you can tailor the training
as well as the specific roles
coming up that you're expecting them to perform.
Yeah. But I think as a PDI as well, working with a unit, I still need the direction ultimately from the commanding officer where that person wants to take the unit physically, and then I obviously give the advice and assist in drawing up the program, and then obviously educating the CFLs on exactly what I want and how I want them to achieve stuff in each phase of training.
I think very much the same in my environment, that say I'm working with team sports, the nature of the way the coach wants to play, the strategies the coach wants to play, is very much going to dictate what sort of physical qualities those athletes need in that environment. They might play a really fast, high-tempo game, so their physical aerobic conditioning needs to be really high. Or they might play a more slower, more power explosive game. So that's a very different, even within the same sport.
Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. The next question comes from Sergeant Mitch Sterling from 1RTB. Ross, he asks, when screening junior athletes, is there a point post-screening where athletes are redirected to a different sport or career based on their screening results? And potentially for the military members, could we, and I'm expanding this on his behalf, could we actually look at where we screen people through their careers and potentially then physiologically push them towards different paths and potentially they joined up for?
Great question.
Probably we don't do it that often. We do some basic screening, but our screening processes probably don't dictate how successful they're going to be in the sport. They identify to us more how the athlete, the limitations of the athlete and how we progress them. We have athletes that have progressed from one sport to another, and a lot of it is based around some of their physiological testing parameters, probably more into the endurance-based sports. We've had a number of athletes transition into like rowing and into cycling. Where we've tested them, they've had really big VO2 maxes. And you go, well, currently you're probably not going to quite make it in more sprint power event, but look at your engine, you've got a really good engine, you can transition you into sports. In the skill-based sports, it's probably not as easy to do that. Because again, it's development of those skills and it's a lot broader requirement set. Say in a team sport, like I believe I've used AFL, there's a physical requirement, also a good knowledge and technical requirement, decision-making requirement, all these things step in there. So you can have athletes who are very skilled in some areas. We go back to North Queensland Cowboys. I was very fortunate. I worked with Canterbury Bulldogs when Justin JT was a junior at the Bulldogs before he moved to North Queensland. And he freely admits he's not the strongest person in the team. He's not the physically fittest person in the team, but his decision-making, his ability to read the game is phenomenal. So that stands him out. But on the opposite side, he's not the weakest in the team. He's not the least fit in the team either. He has a good basic quality and has exceptional qualities as well. So in those sports, you go, well, that's different to something like, say, a VO2 max test where you can go, this guy's got a massive engine and you can be absolutely excel.
So although like you can utilise physiological and physical testing to maybe ascertain whether they're better suited toward a certain path, I think the one thing you can't or is hard to measure is the psychological aspects. You know, what is inside and between their ears that makes them suited psychologically toward doing a job.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, it's reasonable to think we need a baseline level of performance to be able to conduct the trade. I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption at all. However, having said that, we don't really know what that is at this point in time. So, but we do know that, as you were just saying, the potential, if you think back to the Chief of Army's themes a couple of weeks ago during his address, potential was one of the things that he discussed. And most people have within them the potential to do just about any trade in defence. And if we get the training right, we'll be able to hit those markers where, like your JTs of the world, maybe not everyone's going to be a JT of the world, but he has obviously a lot of potential because he brings a lot of other things to the party that has made him one of the best players in the world, if not the best, for a long period of time. So physiologically, a lot of people will be able to meet the markers that we need for defence. Nearly everyone will be able to, with the right training program that's put behind it. And that's where our challenge then becomes how to implement the training program so it's consistent from the point of entry right the way through to the land trained force.
Excellent, thank you. And we'll come on. I've got some questions on the mental side of it coming up. I am aware of time. It would be wrong of me not to include a question from a PTI to this panel. It is the year of the PTIs, and this is a strength and conditioning talk. So Sergeant Jimmy Wright from 11CHC, he's a PTI, who says the SWOT analysis that is conducted for AIS athletes and what we do as Army PTIs is similar. However, the foundation, platform and starting state is on a different spectrum. The specificity of an AIS athlete is based on sports scientific training versus soldiering, which is based on an occupational objective. How does strength and conditioning application apply to the variable occupational requirements of the modern warfighter?
Well, I don't know, like, just to say, I think we can probably all agree here that the principles and components of fitness, whether you are training for an occupation or training for a sport, are the same. Exercise science is the same, whether you're applying it to training for an occupation like we are in the Army or training again for a sport. It's the application and exercise prescription that you select to apply to the individual to make the most impact, as we were discussing before.
You could almost say that the physical requirements of a housewife and an elite athlete are the same thing, but the degree of which they need to be trained to are different. A housewife still requires an element of aerobic capacity, just the degree of which she requires it is different to an elite athlete. I think that goes back to Sergeant Sterling's question of the analysis of things in the first place.
What does that soldier need to perform for the upcoming exercise or next task? Any unknowns you can try and prepare for, and then just do your best to prescribe exercise as well as integrating other components of service appropriately, so you can get the best outcome for that individual and the team.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, I think it's very difficult. You know, Ross deals with a much smaller population than what we can expect to deal with in defence. So our entry points are obviously significantly varied from what theirs are. It doesn't mean to say we can't work with what we actually have currently. And I think that that's probably the important part to remember, because ultimately, as Tim was saying, the levels are so varied, but we still have a standard within it. If you consider fire and movement, the drills of fire and movement, your risk of injury will reduce significantly if you have better mobility and the strength to get yourself up and down off the ground. If your cardiovascular endurance is strong and solid, then you'll be able to do that repeatedly, time and again. At what point in there, you know, does that person then become elite in status? Well, it's irrelevant to us. We just need to be able to do it to a point where they can actually do that time and time again with reduced risk of injury. And I think that that's probably the important thing to remember, rather than considering everyone to be elite in the field.
Again, that elite status is quite interesting. I've worked with the equestrian program, the Paralympic equestrian program, a couple of Olympic cycles ago. Their main concern, a lot of their concern, is about the horse. So, and how fit and strong the horse is and how it will control it. But one of the big things about their culture is, again, their total focus is the horse. So I had to pull their focus back out and go, you need to be fit enough to be on that horse, effectively making good decisions, because there's good research to say if you have a good baseline level of fitness, you mentally become less fatigued as you go through the process as well. So you're making better decisions, you're making quicker judgment calls on the horse and how you control the horse and making those things. So are those athletes still elite? Absolutely. Are they the massive aerobic beasts or the strength beasts that some other athletes are? Absolutely not, but I still see them as very much elite in their field. So how you target that field is, I think, is irrelevant in this, whether it's Army and your guys, and what's the outcomes you're trying to achieve in that occupation or in that sport, and how do you become elite in that space so you have no limitations, no limiting factors that's going to stop you being exceptional in that area.
Probably one of those things, there's no sort of cookie cutter approach as well. The individual athlete and aspects of that person need to always be taken into consideration when you're prescribing exercise.
At the end of the day, yes.
Yeah.
Brilliant. We're going to take a slight change of tact here now. This question comes from Captain Stewart from 1 Sisby in Darwin. He says, as an organisation, Army is, broadly speaking, on top of strength and conditioning. Our soldiers know how to train and are given ample opportunity to do so. Where we seem to fail is with diet. Across the panel, what examples of best practice can you give where you've seen an organisation's approach to diet have a positive effect, and how was this achieved? And Ross, from Diet for Elite Athletes, how can we incorporate some of that in the Army?
I suppose diet goes back in my mind, not my subject area or area of expertise. Diet goes back to, again, going back to the basic fundamentals of what good diet is and how effectively you can put it into your environment. One of my sports I've worked with a lot over the last 10 years is boxing and some of the other combat sports. It's all about weight management. And a lot of the cases, again, there has been smart and intelligent about how you use an appropriate diet, but that plan is to go back over a long stretch of time. So we work with the boxing athletes not in the last 2 or 3 weeks to maintain weight. We work them over the 6 months leading into major competitions to get the appropriate weight management, to get the right physical outcomes we want to achieve. So again, going back to the basics and doing the basics really well. But if all you have on hand is KFC and McDonald's, it's very hard to then institute a really intelligent nutritional program in that space.
So one of the, I guess, observations, now I'll just jotted down a couple of points while Ross was talking then. So Kapooka is a very important place for us. It's the initial point where people are captured, not just Kapooka, we'll say RMC and ADFA as well, where Army is your initial entry to the military, basically. So that is a prime opportunity for people to be educated with nutrition and diet and how to manage yourself into the future. Now, if it's not sort of done there, then at what point in the spectrum, in the training spectrum, does it come up again? It's probably not really going to happen. We don't have a formal approach to doing that, other than the messes, providing a certain amount of fixed food nutritional income or nutritional delivery through that point. But then people will choose to go to KFC and Macca's or whatever the other options are out there, or they'll follow the health magazines to create a diet for themselves. So one of the things that we do up in Townsville is as a way to try to minimise that risk to the soldiers. Now, there's 2 things here. There's diet when injured and diet for performance, I think, are the 2 main ones. So when we're training for performance and we have a diet that gives us the relevant input for that, if we don't change that when we're injured, the risk is great to then start coming on with other problems, an increased weight gain quite rapidly from that, and then the resultant problems that come with that, with damage to joints and things, and then you've got to return more activity to come back from that. So that's one part. So one way we try to mitigate that is we're actually, through our human performance financial education that we're doing, we're actually giving our financial money that we're using, we're delivering nutrition packages to the brigade, out to the units. So we've sort of recognised that as being a problem. The brigade itself has recognised that being a problem. So we've started paying for, through our funding available through human performance, we've started paying for units themselves to get educated and upskilled on how to manage their dietary intake, basically. And it's not, what was that? Yeah,
no, that's good.
Yeah, so we're using that basically at the moment. So the export nutrition package, but basically if you get it down to early education at Kapooka and people learn to apply it from the early days, then I think that's probably one of the more important parts. It is the individual buy-in at the end of the day.
And it's also going to be, like we've mentioned, the key themes being a collection of data, like an individual, even if it is an individual level of developing that data on themselves and tracking what they're actually putting in their body and coming up with a plan to move from that.
Yeah, I think sort of body composition sort of works hand in hand with diet as well. You do require a certain amount of fat deposits in your body, for example, to sustain yourself outfield when you're in periods of low nutritional value or intake. So yeah, sort of considerations there.
Well, we do. I mean, we've got scanners, body scanners, and you could argue the merits of a body scanner to forever, but basically at the end of the day, it gives us a quick snapshot of how a person is when they first come into the brigade, and then also when they're coming through our programs which we run, but also at the point of injury too. We also capture them on the scanners now. And then you can see how they're going in 4 weeks to 6 weeks. It's that creeping change in body type that people don't recognise until it's almost too late. So we can see them early on, we can capture them through it. And again, it's a fairly low cost activities. It's just people can turn up for the value of the body scanner, which is not that expensive really as a general.
Excellent. I want to move on now, if I can. noting we've got about 5 minutes left. We've had a lot of questions coming in about mental conditioning and the mental side of developing an athlete and developing soldiers. As an example, this question is from Signaler Troy Beatty from 145 Signal Squadron. He says, how much credit is given to an athlete for their physical attributes because of their mental conditioning, and how close is the relationship between mental and physical conditioning for you at AIS, Ross?
I think it's phenomenally close. It's very much, you can develop the physical capabilities of the athlete, you can develop their skills in the sport, but if you put them in an environment like an Olympic Games or NRL Grand Final, AFL Grand Final, and they fall apart, then all that training and that development is useless. They very much work very much hand in hand, and they are very linked together. An athlete who knows that they're physically ready, they've done the training, they've done all the work they need to do, they're skilled in what they need to do. There's a confidence that comes with that, and the mental ability is important. But it has been identified over the last 2 Olympics as something that sports have come back to the AIS and gone, this is an issue for us. It actually is part of our memorandum of understanding with the Army that we go into this space and how we can collaborate in this space to get these outcomes with the Special Forces. We're going to start we call our Gold Medal Ready program, which is starting soon, which is linking with the commandos to RAO and SAF in Sydney. So we've identified that it's phenomenally important in our environment. It very much fits hand in hand, and we tried to develop that as part of our training package. So as all our training, we developed this mental approach as well.
Excellent.
Next question.
No, that was brilliant. I've got time for one more question. And this comes from Mr. Michael Cross, who's the head coach at the Barracks Gym, which is a foundational tactical strength and conditioning facility located in Brisbane. He said, for private facilities that prepare ADF applicants in strength and conditioning, how do we bridge the gap between military and the private sector to ensure that the needs are being met to allow a higher success rate for new recruits? And this links into some other questions, such as, for example, the Regimental Sergeant Major of the Defence School of Signals asked about, we have a large range of people within the Defence Force from sort of 17, 18 all the way through to 60 plus. Other people have sent in questions about how do we prepare people and get a base standard for joining the Army. So I suppose, what can we do strength and conditioning wise to prepare people to join the Army and to bridge that gap between the civilian and the recruit?
Well, yeah.
I think the best thing you could do is really just do a needs analysis, as Ross was saying. We could go strategic level and talk of recruiting and the information that we're giving to people coming into the Army, but that's a whole separate discussion in itself. But doing a needs analysis of the individual and what's required in order to be a functioning member of the Defence Force, and that's where it comes down to strength, power, aerobic capacity, and combining all those things, and an individual doing a self-assessment or an assessment under someone else's control, and acknowledging their own individual strengths and individual weaknesses, and coming up with a plan in order to mitigate those.
And probably not trying to rush the process as well.
Yeah, it's a long-term thing, and I think that's another key theme that we've had here is, like, it shouldn't be a 6-month approach, it should be a 2 to 3 year approach.
And I think also one of those ones as well is understanding the entry requirements into Army and applying those entry standards and trying to exceed the minimum standards, but also applying the standards that we as PDIs assess when they hit those training establishments as well. That if they're not put under the pressure of being assessed formally, a lot of the times we have seen trainees or candidates crumble in the assessment process just because they haven't been exposed to standards being applied on them before. So maybe to reduce that gap then is, during your training, is apply standards, and if they don't achieve the standards, don't count it.
And I think
Brilliant. Gentlemen, I'm going to have to cut it there. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I know you want to get the final comment in, Tim, but we're going to have to cut it there because we've run out of time. Look, on behalf of the Cove team and the Cove Talk, Ross, Simon, Chris, and Tim, I'd like to thank you very much for your candid comments and for answering the questions. For all of those at the outstations, we have a plethora of questions which have come flooding in. Obviously, we couldn't get through all of them. I've spoken to the panelists. We will give those questions to the panelists who will provide some written answers, and we will place them online on the Cove when we post the video, probably next week, late next week. I will also seek, there were some questions which came through which I couldn't ask, they were policy based. I will see if we can get someone from Headquarters Forces Command or Army Headquarters to answer some of those policy-based questions as well, as they are obviously of interest to you throughout the Army. That's the end of this Cove Talk. I just want to advertise the next Cove Talk, and this follows on really from the questions that we just had about mental resilience and mental conditioning. To coincide with the Invictus Games on the 17th of October between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Kate Philp will be joining us live from the UK. Kate in Afghanistan became became Britain's first female combat amputee since the end of the Second World War. Since then, she's overcome that adversity and was even part of the British, Australian, and American team who walked to the South Pole with Prince Harry. She'll be talking about resilience and how to overcome adversity. And I think it's good that we can do that as part of the build-up for the Invictus Games. So please, we look forward to you joining us there. The other thing I would just like to say to the outstations and to the Army as a whole is we're coming towards the end of the year. We're looking at the programme of Cove Talks for next year, and I want to know from you what has worked and what hasn't. What part of the talks haven't worked or have you not found engaging? What parts have you found engaging, and what would you like to see next year? You can send those through to our Gmail account, which is soldiercove@gmail.com, with your suggestions. In the next sort of month or so, we'll be conducting analysis of your recommendations and putting in place a program for next year. So we look forward to hearing from you. For the members of the panel, once again, thank you very much. Thank you for hosting us here at the Australian Institute of Sports on a nice summer's or spring's day down here in Canberra. And for the rest of you, thank you for joining us at the Cove, the home of the Australian profession of arms.